$6 trillion we already printed was just the teaser.
On December 20th, 2024, the Federal Reserve released its latest money supply data, and the numbers are enough to keep any sane person awake at night. M2, which is the broadest measure of money actually circulating in our economy, now stands at a staggering $21.2 trillion. To give you some context on why that matters, back in January 2020, before the world changed forever, that number was $15.4 trillion. In less than 5 years, the United States has conjured $5.8 trillion out of thin air, representing a 38% increase in the total money supply in under 60 months. To really grasp the insanity of this, you have to look back at 1980, when the entire U.S. money supply was just $1.6 trillion. We have printed more than 3.5 times the entire 1980 economy in just 5 years. Yet what nobody in the mainstream media is telling you is that the real inflation hasn't even started to bite yet. What we felt between 2021 and 2023, that official 9% spike and the 20% jump in your grocery bills and rent, was nothing but a teaser trailer. The main event is still backstage, because nearly $6 trillion doesn't just evaporate, it moves through the system in waves. The first wave hit asset prices, sending stocks up 60% and housing up 47% since 2020. The second wave slammed into consumer prices like a freight train. But the third wave, the one that historically destroys the middle class, is still building on the horizon. It's not just about the money we've already printed. It's about the $90 trillion we are mathematically forced to print over the next 15 years, just to service the debt we created by printing that first batch. This is the classic debt inflation spiral, and once this engine starts, it doesn't stop until the currency is shredded and the middle class is annihilated. There is no political path to paying off a $36 trillion national debt. The math simply doesn't exist. The only exit strategy for the government is inflation, massive, sustained, life-altering inflation that will transfer $20 to $30 trillion in wealth from savers and workers to asset holders and the state over the next decade. This isn't a theory, it's pattern recognition. This is the script every failing empire has followed, from Rome to Weimar Germany to Nixon's America, and we are currently following it faster than any of them. Every currency collapse in history follows a rigid 4-stage pattern that has remained unchanged for 2,000 years. Stage 1 is the foundation, where a nation builds a trusted currency backed by something tangible, like gold or silver, creating centuries of expansion and saving. Stage 2 is the beginning of debasement, where a government faces the costs of war or welfare and realizes taxes aren't enough. They start reducing the metal content or printing paper, promising it's just a temporary measure. Stage 3 is the loss of control, where inflation runs rampant and the middle class holding cash gets obliterated, while the elites who are closest to the money printer buy up assets at fire sale prices. Finally, Stage 4 is the reset, where the old currency is buried, wealth has been consolidated in the hands of the few, and the people who lose everything never even saw the trap. Let's look at Rome in 64 AD under Emperor Nero. He needed money desperately, so he reduced the silver purity of the denarius from 95% to 80%. Most Romans didn't notice. The coin looked the same and spent the same, but it held 15% less real value. This was Stage 2. Fast forward 130 years, and the purity had dropped to 46%. By 253 AD, it was down to 20%, and a decade later it was just 2% silver. Prices exploded by 1,000%. A measure of wheat that cost 100 denarii in 150 AD cost 100,000 just a century later. The Roman middle class, the merchants and soldiers on fixed salaries, watched their life savings turn into the price of a loaf of bread, while the senatorial class holding land and livestock saw their assets appreciate into the millions. By the time Rome hit stage 4, the broad middle class was gone, replaced by a few hundred families owning almost everything. We saw the same pattern move at lightning speed in Weimar Germany between 1921 and 1923. Faced with impossible war reparations, the government chose to print marks instead of raising taxes. In January 1919, it was 9 marks to a dollar. By November 1923, it was 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Families who had saved for generations were destroyed in months. A professional with 100,000 marks in the bank, enough for 5 years of luxury, couldn't even buy a postage stamp. Yet the industrialists who borrowed marks to buy factories and the farmers who owned land survived because their debt was inflated away to zero, while their assets held their real utility. The psychological trauma of this theft literally paved the way for the rise of extremism. Then we have our own modern history, starting August 15, 1971, when President Nixon appeared on television to suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. This was the Nixon shock, and it turned the dollar into a pure fiat currency. For 27 years under Bretton Woods, the dollar was anchored to gold, but America was hemorrhaging its reserves to fund the Vietnam War and social programs. When Britain asked for $3 billion in gold to be moved from Fort Knox, Nixon realized the vault was too empty to comply. He closed the gold window, and the dollar floated into the abyss. The 1970s delivered the first taste of this debasement with stagflation, but the real impact was the beginning of a systematic wealth gap. In 1971, the top 1% held 23% of the wealth. Today, that number is over 32% and rising, because unlimited printing always benefits the people who own the assets the new money flows into first. We are now in stage 3, and the acceleration is becoming visible. Our national debt is $36.2 trillion as of late 2024, a 91-fold increase since Nixon ended the gold standard. We're running annual deficits of $2 trillion, while our interest payments alone hit $1.13 trillion this fiscal year. That is more than the entire defense budget. This is the death spiral. Interest payments add to the deficit, which adds to the debt, which creates more interest. By 2035, interest payments could hit $3 trillion annually if rates stay elevated. The government has no way out. Cutting spending is a political fantasy because Social Security and Medicare are untouchable, and even eliminating the entire military wouldn't balance the books. Raising taxes by the 40% required to cover the gap is political suicide. That leaves option 3, printing money to monetize the debt. This is what the Federal Reserve is doing when it buys treasuries with new money, and it is the primary engine of the coming $90 trillion inflation. Between 2025 and 2027, we will see deficits consistently exceed $2 trillion, while foreign buyers continue to dump their treasury holdings. The Fed will be forced to ramp up its purchases, growing the money supply even faster. By the 2030s, the Social Security and Medicare trust funds will deplete, requiring another $500 billion in annual printing just to keep the promises made to seniors. Real inflation, not the manipulated CPI, will likely average 10 to 15% annually through this period. This means by 2040, a house that cost $400,000 in 2020 will likely carry a $1.6 million price tag. If you are a middle-class wage earner, this math is your execution warrant. The median household with a net worth of $200,000 in 2024 will watch their house appreciate to $700,000, but in real terms, they will have lost a third of their purchasing power. Their retirement account might look like it's growing, hitting $350,000 by 2034, but that money will only buy what $135,000 buys today. This is the inflation trap. The numbers get bigger, but your life gets smaller. You will feel poorer every single year despite getting raises, and you will realize you can't afford to move because while your house doubled in price, the new ones tripled. Meanwhile, the top 1%, whose wealth is 80% concentrated in stocks and real estate, will see their net worth explode in real terms. Their debt, like a $2 million mortgage, stays fixed, while the currency it's denominated in loses value, effectively making their debt disappear while their assets track with the printing press. This is a massive forced wealth transfer from those who work for a living and save cash to those who own the infrastructure of the world. Mathematically, the U.S. has to reduce its debt-to-GDP ratio from over 300% to something sustainable like 150%. And the only way to do that without a catastrophic default is to run 10% inflation for a decade. Every government in history has made this choice because inflation is a slow-motion catastrophe that's easier to survive politically than an immediate systemic collapse. We are approaching stage 4, the reset. This could mean the dollar losing its reserve status, a new gold-backed digital currency, or even authoritarian financial repression where the government forces you to keep your money in banks while they tax it through negative rates. By 2040, the dollar will likely still be here, but it will have lost 60 to 70% of its current value, having completed the largest wealth heist in history. We are at the inflection point right now. The trillions printed since 2020 are still working through the system, and the next 90 trillion are inevitable. If you are holding cash, wages, or bonds, you are holding the currency that is being sacrificed to pay for the mistakes of the past century. History doesn't lie, and the math doesn't negotiate. The middle class holding paper and promises always gets destroyed in these cycles, and the only way to stay on the right side of this transfer is to understand that the operating system of the dollar is crashing. The sound of the fall will be loud, but for those who aren't paying attention, the silence of their evaporated savings will be the real tragedy of stage 5. This is the reality of the coming years. Your salary will rise, your assets will look bigger, and yet the life you thought you were building will slowly slip through your fingers unless you move out of the path of the printing press. This isn't just about finance. It's about recognizing the pattern that has buried every superpower for 2,000 years. The countdown has already started, and the first wave of the $90 trillion inflation is already at your door.